Hi, Benabel here. Sorry right off the bat that this video is going to be a little bit rambly. I don't have anything prepared. As you can see, I just took one very quick page of notes and outlined just to make sure I stay on track, or at least try very hard to stay on track. The lighting here is a little bit odd because it's early in the morning. I'm recording this pretty much before I head into the office, but I really wanted to give you an overview and introduction of the course to see if it might pique your interest. Okay, so basically I'm going to be talking about the I Ching course that I've just offered that's titled I Ching and the Practitioner. Now, one of the things that I feel like is a little bit unique about this course is that I'm not just teaching you I Ching divination. A lot of the classes that I saw for the same price were just really about teaching you how, basically how to interpret the hexagrams, the oracles, maybe how to do the divination. But this one's going to sort of give you a very large scope in terms of breadth and depth of the cultural and historical context for the I Ching. So the I Ching, well, the premise and the foundation for what became the 64 hexagrams, of course, started in Neolithic China. I'll get into the details very much into the intricacies in the course. But basically in Neolithic China, you've already had the foundation of the I Ching hexagrams paved, although not necessarily the actual 64 hexagrams yet. This is talking about the Xia, Shang, and Zhou, the first three dynasties of China. Then in the Zhou dynasty is when you have King Wen, and that's when legend has that the I Ching was given birth while he was imprisoned by the Shang dynasty emperor. When he came up with the hexagrams, the mandate of heaven passed from the Shang dynasty to the Wen family name, and that's how we then have the Zhou dynasty. And so King Wen is attributed with the I Ching hexagrams. And from there, initially, it really was something reserved for priests and actually priestesses. In the earliest dynasties of China, the primary diviners using the I Ching were female, were priestesses. They were typically the concubines of the kings, but specific concubines. The emperor would marry a whole bunch of people. Sometimes it'd also be the empress, but it was usually a female that was believed to be gifted with these prophetic abilities that had the unique quality to commune between heaven and earth. So it was usually female, although all of the main scholars, interestingly enough, all of the high priests and all of the people associated with the progress of I Ching as a text were male. So there's that sort of gender normative behavior going on throughout Chinese history. But what I really want to talk about was how the initial foundation of the I Ching wasn't necessarily philosophy, it was actually divination. It was shamanic in nature, it's occult. There was this idea that not everybody could use the I Ching or access the I Ching. The I Ching was something very much reserved for priests and priestesses, people who were in a unique position to connect directly to divinities. It was later then, well, I'll talk about whether or not the I Ching is Taoist. It's kind of a tenuous relationship. I know the Facebook group that I created is called, I Ching and Esoteric Taoism, because at this point in time, after so many thousands of years, I Ching has become rooted in the foundation of Taoism, and Taoism is pretty much the foundation of Chinese culture and history. But, the two sort of started at separate points. That's the reality. The reality is the I Ching system and Taoism started from slightly separate points in time around the same dynasty, though. That's the reason they are sort of syncretically merged in the same dynasty, but in different points. And they sort of came together because they made sense. It made sense for them to come together. And then, of course, Confucianism was wrapped up in anything Chinese, and so there's also Confucianist and legalist, dimensions to the I Ching as we see it today. But before all of that, it did begin as something that was occult. It began as something that was divinatory in nature, prophetic in nature. And that's what I want to go back to. I know a lot of people today talk about the I Ching as philosophy, and it absolutely is. I mean, The reason it's philosophy is because the idea is that this is a sacred text, the word of the gods, that explains the rules of the universe. It explains how the universe operates, and therefore, if it explains how the universe operates, by default, it's a form of philosophy. But a practitioner can use the I Ching, the book of changes, to in fact have not just an interactive relationship with the gods, but also to interact with nature, with earth. In the book of changes, there's this idea that every single one of the hexagrams is a code, a map or revelation on how you can change and modify nature. That's why it's called the book of changes. What is spellcrafting? What do practitioners do? Spellcrafting is all about change. It's all about controlling change, creating change. So the book of changes is in fact a directive to the practitioner on how to work magic. It's literally a grimoire. The I Ching is literally a grimoire in that sense, because you can read into these 64 hexagrams as instructions on how to modify nature and how to create change, how to activate change, not just divine changes in nature. Therefore, it's not just divination, but it's also craft. And that's really what I want to go back to, the origins of the I Ching before it became philosophy. Then, of course, the bulk majority of Chinese history, of course, the I Ching was philosophy. And the reason that happened is because it became integrated into the civil service exams. And so from the Han Dynasty all the way until the 1890s, Han Dynasty is like, oh, if I remember correctly, this is off the top of my head, 200 BC. I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was 200 BC to 200 AD-ish, around that time. But from then all the way to the 1890s, you have the I Ching wrapped up in scholarly disseminations. It's wrapped up in Lao Tzu and Taoist philosophy, legalism. Confucianism is another philosophical approach or perspective, and so it got wrapped up in these various prongs of Chinese philosophy. Therefore, I Ching in tandem became a form of philosophy that was learned from people of all walks of life. So it became sort of introduced into the so-called mainstream of the Chinese consciousness, and then it became again a cult after the communist takeover. So while the I Ching was very much embedded into the Chinese consciousness for most of Chinese imperial history, in terms of modern China, it did get lost, and it was intentional. When the communists took over in China, there was this huge pushback against all things that were cultural, historic, ancient, all of that. They wanted to be modern, they wanted to be scientific, atheistic. It's all about the nation, very nationalistic, when the communists took over in modern China. And that's why after the fall of the Qing dynasty, you also saw the unfortunate loss of in decline of the I Ching from the Chinese consciousness when you enter modern China, when you enter the 1800s. So we want to really go back. First, we will talk about the history of I Ching as philosophy, since for the most of Chinese history, yes, most of Chinese history, it was philosophy. But going back to the origins, if you really look at the history, it began as divination to mark the transition of the mandate of heaven from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty. And that was King Wen, who was the one accredited with conceiving of the I Ching. Though, there's this idea that it was channeled as well. So we'll get into that, and how the verses, not just the actual hexagrams, but the verses that came after the hexagrams throughout history and the authorship being lost in history, there is this association of it being channeled from the gods. That's why the I Ching is seen as also a sacred text, and we'll talk about it as a sacred text. And so, yeah, basically that's what I want to say. We talk about the I Ching as philosophy, divination, and also as spellcrafting, how to use the Book of Changes pretty much as a grimoire. Then the thing that I wanted to not necessarily market or showcase too much in sort of like the opening materials, but it is such a huge component to the course that I wanted to talk about in this video, is that I did evoke and invoke Zhou Tian Xuanyu, or the Lady of the Ninth Heaven. And she's a part of, although seemingly a minor part of Chinese Taoist mythology, she's a critical part because she was the patron deity, so to speak. I'll explain why it's just not really a deity, but the patron goddess, if you will, of the Yellow Emperor, who's the father of Chinese civilization. There's this idea that she's one of the proteges of Shi Wangmu, Shi Wangmu is the Empress Mother of the West. She's basically like a dark goddess, very powerful, one of the four directional deities, and she holds court in Kunlun Mountain, kind of like the Axis Mundi of sort of the Chinese cosmos. And in her court, she has a protege, one of her best and brightest, so to speak, and that was the Lady of the Ninth Heaven. And her persona is a little bit more kind of like an archangel, based on my understanding of sort of both the Western and Eastern mystery traditions and theology. She's best likened to an archangel. I think that really makes the most sense. You'll see her as fairy or goddess, but it really is kind of like an archangel figure. And so she descended down from heaven to help the Yellow Emperor win a specific war. So there's this idea that she sided with the Chinese if she helped the Han people win a war and establish the Chinese civilization. And in doing so, she taught magic. She taught magic, and she taught military strategy to the Yellow Emperor, and that's what she's associated with. Her symbols are the sword and the gourd. The sword symbolizes war. It symbolizes strength, somebody who's, a master of combat and all forms of combat. Then, of course, the other symbol is the gourd. In Chinese, the gourd symbolizes medicine and healing, so she also knows the magic and the art of healing. And I evoked and invoked her to watch over everything that I did from the beginning in terms of beginning the whole work with I Ching, and I wanted her to be a part of anybody who was part of this course, to sort of be an invisible hand of guidance. And how close you want to get in terms of that particular relationship is entirely up to you. I leave that open to you. I give all access and I explain how and why, but then what you want to do with that is entirely up to you. If you want to just use this course just for the I Ching text, just to learn divination or just to learn about the philosophy and to keep it very mundane, that's totally cool. But if you want to take it deeper and use the tools of this class to access divinity, then I hope that that will be made available to you through this course. Now, the deliverables in terms of what you're getting, you get the book. I translated the I Ching, the Zoe. There's actually 3 formats of the I Ching. I can explain that. I will explain that in the video lectures. But I used the Zoe, which is the most popular one. And I did the translations myself, and then had my father and one of my cousins, who's an I Ching master in China, to kind of look it over and see how I did. But my approach to translation was a little bit different, and it brings in a lot more of my occult background and not just the sort of scholarly background. And I explain and give all of the context for how I did the translations in a separate handout once you get the course materials. The book is to be used as bibliomancy, and so when I give you the PDF files for you to print out, I don't have like this cover that has like the name or my name on it. I want to keep it very discreet, and I also give you the option to create and design your own cover so that you can turn it into something that does become like a sacred text that you can use in a professional setting. So if you have it on your reading desk or you take it somewhere where you're going to be reading for clients, it doesn't look like you have a commercial book. It can be whatever you want it to look like. And that was the intention for the book. And it is for bibliomancy, so it doesn't have any of the expository materials on like the background or history of the I Ching. That's taught through this course. I wanted that book to be nothing more than just for bibliomancy only. Then you also get an oracle deck. I sort of put together the essential meanings of the 64 hexagrams and made 64 oracle cards so that you can also use the I Ching in cartomantic form, or as an oracle deck. And I also explained the many different ways you can use the oracle deck. You get the digital files for the oracle deck. So that another interesting thing is, let's say you do use the I Ching divination in a professional setting, what you can actually do is you can actually send just the image files of the 1 or 2 hexagrams that's divined for a client, so they have that particular image. Whatever you want to do, we'll talk about it in the class. I'll show you the different ways of using it, but you also get the oracle deck. And the methodologies of divination taught, you're going to learn the yarrow stock method, which is dated to around the Zhou dynasty or just a little bit after that. Then you have the rice grains methodology, which is dated to around the Han dynasty. Some say the Qin dynasty, depending on who you talk to. You know, there's a lot of disagreements among the historic scholars. And then I'm going to teach the 3 coin toss method, which is perhaps the most popular and most well-known methodology in the West. Then, of course, you get the 64 oracle cards, so I show how you can use the I Ching and integrate it into cartomantic forms, or use it as a form of cartomancy and use it as an oracle deck. And so those are the primary modes taught: yarrow stock, rice grains. I don't really hear a lot of people in the West talk about the rice grain methodology, although it is pretty common in the Eastern traditions. So you're going to learn the rice grains methodology, the 3 coin toss methodology, and of course you get the oracle deck. And I'm going to just sort of talk briefly about how I would use the oracle deck, but that's not going to be very in-depth because I figure it's pretty intuitive and you can figure it out on your own. It's just an oracle deck. It's pretty easy to figure out. Then finally, what's very important about this class is talking about becoming the priest or becoming the priestess. Now, like I said, originally, the original intention of the I Ching was to commune with God. And if you read the text of the I Ching, the original lines of the verses, it's unambiguous that there is a presumption of a God. There's a presumption of a monotheistic God principle. And then there's also references to the gods. For example, paying homage to the gods, or it tells you to create an altar for the gods. And so it has references to gods in the polytheistic implication as well. It has both. But the idea is it's supposed to be an instructional manual for a priest or a priestess to then be able to interpret the signs and omens from God or from the gods, and then, for example, report it to a king, or report it to a country, or report it in modern day times to yourself to figure out what to do with your life, or to your client. So there's this idea of really using it as a priest or as a priestess, and the logistics of that, the intention setting and the ritualistic aspects of embodying a priest or priestess mentality when approaching the I Ching. So being a priest or priestess, there's 2 components, of course. The first is divining for others. Therefore, a big component is how to divine for others. And the other, of course, is divine communion. How to use the I Ching to access divinity. And how we define divinity is going to be left open. I don't really get too religious about that. There's this idea of either the higher self, or the idea of a particular god or goddess, or the particular Zhou Tian Xuanyi, who I've invoked and evoked for this course to oversee all of us, or it's somebody that's a patron deity to you. And however you want to define the divine God principle, that's what the I Ching is. It's a tool to commune with that divine God principle. And I'm going to teach you how to integrate the I Ching into your specific path. So the idea is I try to give it to you within the entire universe that is the breadth and depth of Chinese history and culture. And I don't want to take it out of context during the class. That way there isn't this sort of cultural appropriation issue that people always like to, yammer on and on about, because you're going to get the entire universe that the I Ching sprang from, and really understand I Ching in depth. As much as I can impart upon you, you will understand the I Ching in the breadth and scope of it. Then the idea is, once you master that understanding, you have to integrate it into your path in a very personalized way. And that can be be picking and choosing, cherry picking, modifying and adding to it, or figuring out how it works within the construct that is your own spiritual or metaphysical path, and how to use it in your specific approach to craft. And in fact, every aspect of the class, if you notice, does sort of expound on that philosophy. For example, I give you the PDF files for a book, and it has the text of the sacred text in there, but I ask you to do everything on your own in terms of printing or producing it. You get to choose your own cover, create your own cover. Basically, whatever your imagination can come up with is how you modify that text so it really becomes your own. Same with the oracle deck. I ask that you do what you can in terms of your own imagination and creativity and craft to make your copy of the deck your own. So I'm not saying you have to use this specific card back design. I ask you to choose your own card back design. I'll give you different dimensions, different ways of printing it or using it or producing it so that it really is your own. You're putting in a lot of your personal energies and creativity to make it something that transcends what it was originally, keeps all of the original ethos, but then does something to it that becomes integrated into your own unique path. And that, in fact, is Taoism. Taoism is about the path. The idea is that to figure out, we're all going to arrive at the same destination, but we all take different paths. And Taoism, the whole idea of Taoism as a practice is to figure out what your own path is. Embedded into the idea of Taoism is that your path will, by default, look very different from my path. We will have different paths. That's why Taoism has always been very eclectic, sort of pulling and pushing from very different cultural aspects and integrating all of that. That's why also Taoism is so difficult to define. But again, the I Ching sort of got meshed into Taoism, so it is presumed to be an integral part of Chinese Taoism. But at the same time, it did begin at separate points, and so there is this idea that I Ching is sort of outside of Taoism, although it has been integrated over thousands of years into Taoism, and that's why it gets a little bit confusing. And so the class is $42. I explain how to pay for it or do all of the transactions. I do want to say that if you are somebody who has purchased products from me in the past, or you are a client of mine, if basically we've had a relationship prior to this class, you can be put on an installment payment. Just email me and let me know what the situation is, and we can go on an installment payment. If it's only $10 a month, whatever it is that you're able to afford, just talk to me about it so that we can make this class something that is accessible and affordable to you. I've limited it this time only to people who I had a relationship with before this course, only so that it keeps it a little bit more manageable. My past experience meant that if it was open to the entire worldwide public, it became a little bit unmanageable. And also, be sure to find me in the Facebook group. I've set up a Facebook group. It is open to everybody who wants to join, not just to enrollees of the class, so do keep that in mind. There are things I do want you to keep confidential only to members of the course, and the Facebook group is not just members of the course. It's going to be a whole bunch of people, so just bear that in mind when you see that, okay? We will talk, you can talk openly about pieces of the class, and maybe that will actually tempt people to join. So we'll talk about the class in the discussion forum, but just don't post the entire PDF of the book or whatever. But we can definitely talk about content from the course. If you have any questions, please contact me. I'm hoping this introductory video. Sorry it was so rambly. Like I said, I'm basically recording it before I head off to work so that I can get this out of the way and get this to you so you can see it and decide whether or not this class is right for you. And if it is, pre-order it. That way you can get in on sort of some of the cool July deals. I talk about that in the course description. All right, you take care now.